Hello, my name is Antigoni Ladd, and I am here with Greg Howe to share a part of Gettysburg's history that is not often told. In fact, visitors to the Gettysburg National Military Park often drive right by McMillan Woods as part of their battlefield tours. They pass by this sign on West Confederate Avenue, assuming it is only a youth campground and a horse trailer parking lot. They think there's nothing of historic value to see. But that assumption would be wrong. In fact, this area was once the site of 3 major programs with colorful stories from the 20th century. And it's those stories we want to highlight today for you. This area once housed an African American CCC camp, whose Depression-era workers cleared the battlefield to make it the beautiful site you see today. Then in World War II, this became a secret training area for the Army's psychological warfare operations. Still later in the war, it served as a POW camp for German prisoners. So with that teaser about our program, let me introduce ourselves and our interest in this piece of history. Greg Howe brings to this program his 24 years of military service in Army intelligence, plus 10 years as a video producer in private industry. Greg has written 2 books, including The History of Lake Heritage on its 50th birthday. I'm Antigoni Ladd, and I serve on the Historical Society's board, as well as running a leadership training business with my husband Everett. I have edited 3 books of history, one on the Greek families of Westminster, Maryland, one on the history of the Virginia Military Institute, and one on the 100-year anniversary of the Annie M. Warner Hospital. So let's dive into the stories of McMillan Woods and its secret treasures. Okay, let's start our story with the Great Depression and President Roosevelt's public works programs. Surely one of the most successful programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This program gave work to young men, and it helped restore much of the nation's natural resources and rebuild its infrastructure. This map shows the scope of the CCC camps throughout the Depression years, with virtually every state housing multiple programs. They began in 1933 and operated through 1942, when World War II would certainly find plenty of jobs for the young men. In those 9 years of CCC existence, over 3 million young men would find work. They also learned skills, and they were able to send money home to their families. The CCC fought forest fires, planted trees, they built roads and buildings, picnic grounds, swimming areas, campgrounds, and they created many of today's state parks. Pennsylvania had the second highest number of CCC camps. They had 151, second only to California. Thanks to Governor Gifford Pinchot, the state already had a plan in place for just the kind of work that was needed by the CCC. A total of 194,500 Pennsylvania citizens would ultimately serve in the CCC. Gettysburg had 2 camps, both on the battlefield. The first one was created in June of 1933 in Pitzer's Woods on West Confederate Avenue. That one was named Camp NP1, which I'm assuming is for National Park 1. Later that same year, in November 1933, a second camp called NP2 was established in McMillan Woods, also on Confederate Avenue. Both camps had African American enrollees, and the second camp, NP2, became the first in the nation to appoint African American officers. The camp hierarchy would also include work foremen to supervise the projects, engineers, historical foremen, and a forestry technician. So here's a look at it. For this program, we're going to focus on Camp NP2, which is the one in McMillan Woods, because that story is the one that leads directly to World War II. This photo shows the size of the MP2 camp, bigger than you would suspect by looking at it today. To orient yourself, look at the woods in the top left-hand side of the photo, where if you go through the trees, you come out on West Confederate Avenue. Here's a photo of the men arriving in Gettysburg. They've already been issued their uniforms. Why do I point that out? Because throughout the country, many of the CCC enrollees were reporting to their assignments not only hungry and underweight, but they were wearing tattered clothing. In camp, they would be issued uniforms, they'd get 3 square meals a day, and they'd have their housing provided at no charge. Now, prior to the summer of 1933, the battlefield had been maintained by the War Department. That agency had not kept up the battlefield and cemetery during the period following World War I. So when the National Park Service took charge of the battlefield and the cemetery in 1933, it inherited the War Department's maintenance needs. There would be ample work for the enrollees in the CCC, as well as the National Park Service staff. Here you see the men painting the fence separating the National Cemetery from Evergreen Cemetery. Now, this was a bigger project than it appears in this picture because they had to tear down the old fence and erect a new one. Now, this project is one of the most important that they did. They reset the gravestones in the National Cemetery. The superintendent described the project this way, quote, "The appearance of the cemetery is once more one to create the desired feeling of rest and respect. The headstones, loosely set, had been lifted and forced out of line by the frost and weather. These are now all firmly set in concrete, well below the frost line." One of the enrollees, a man named Frank Deering, was so impressed by the sacredness of this work that he wrote a poem called Remembering. I'll just read you one section, which I think is very personal in its tone. He wrote, "The soldiers fought to set us free, and we, the boys of the CCC, pay our respect to the boys in blue who nobly fell for a cause so true." And here are the African American officers of the camp, along with one white face, third from the left. I'm hoping that this is the park superintendent, James Robert McConaughey, who served here from 1933 to 41, because I've read so many wonderful things about him. He was the very first superintendent for the National Park Service in Gettysburg, and he was responsible for directing most of the projects that the CCC completed here. McConaughey himself was a World War I veteran, and he documented the work of the CCC camps very carefully throughout his stay. He moved on to become a regional director in the Park Service, where his final assignment was in Richmond, Virginia, where he died in 1960. However, his body was returned to Gettysburg, where he is now buried at the National Cemetery, a place that he helped to preserve and improve. Another project of the CCC enrollees was preparing the battlefield for the 75th reunion of the Civil War veterans. They worked on the roads, eliminating some of the most dangerous curves at Culp's Hill and Little Round Top. They cleared the forests. They cut brush, repaired farm buildings on the battlefield. They cleaned up the Civil War monuments. They opened old drains and built seating areas. And they helped construct the Peace Light Memorial, including laying in the gas lines that keep the flame going. They also worked with the Army to set up the tents you see pictured here, where the veterans stayed. More than 1,800 veterans coming to the final reunion in Gettysburg. This photo shows President Franklin D. Roosevelt arriving in Gettysburg, where he was the keynote speaker at the 75th reunion. It was his initiative that brought the CCC camps to life, and so I think it's very fitting that he witnessed that day some of the work of the enrollees in his program. Here is President Roosevelt addressing the crowd of 250,000 people on July 3, 1938. This president is also a link between the Civil War, a la the veterans at this reunion, the Public Works Programs, the CCC, and World War II, where he was our president right up until the end. In April 1937, the first camp, the one in Pitzer's Wood, was closed, but Camp NP2 would continue until 1942. I'd love to tell you more stories about the camps, but we don't have time tonight. So my suggestion would be, if any of you are interested in learning more about both CCC camps, there are two excellent articles on the internet. One is an article written by Park Ranger Casimir Rozecki, dated March 2015. It's in the National Park Service blog. The article's title is, quote, "Fighting Today for a Better Tomorrow, the Civilian Conservation Corps at Gettysburg," unquote. And there's an entire book that has the inside stories of the park. Its title is Administrative History, Gettysburg National Military Park and National Cemetery. It's dated July 1991, and the author is Harlan Unrau, U-N-R-A-U. Both sources are available online. So with this overview of the CCC camps, I hope you have a sense of the importance of the history that took place in McMillan Woods and Pitzer's Woods. The work of the men of the CCC is still with us in the road work, the monuments, the beauty of the park, the cemetery, the Peace Light Memorial. I'll turn over this next part of the program to Greg Howe, who will share the story of how the CCC camp would have a new life and become named Camp Sharp in World War II.
The story of Camp Sharp starts at Camp Ritchie. Camp Ritchie, later named Fort Ritchie, was located in the Catoctin Mountains near Blue Ridge Summit. Camp Ritchie was a training area for the Maryland National Guard. In June 1942, the War Department assumed control of Camp Ritchie and established the Military Intelligence Training Center, or MITC. Its primary mission was to train soldiers in intelligence functions and counterintelligence. From July 1942 to September 1945, over 19,000 soldiers were trained there. Along the way, it was given the mission of training a company of soldiers in psychological warfare operations. Brigadier General Charles Banfield, the commander of the MITC, was tasked with training the unit, the First Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company, or MRB, to perform psychological warfare operations in support of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. This invasion was, of course, led by General Dwight David Eisenhower. The MRB proved its worth when an entire regiment of German soldiers surrendered to the Allies. A German regiment is about 2,000 soldiers, so the payoff was about 10 to 1. 200 MRB soldiers caused the surrender of an estimated 2,000 German soldiers. Eisenhower was a major proponent of more MRBs for deployment to Europe. In 1944, the Army funded an expansion to Camp Ritchie to the tune of $5 million. When the order was given to expand the MRB program to an additional 4 companies, the senior leadership at Camp Ritchie had not provided for another 800 soldiers and their equipment. And possibly the general was not enthusiastic about a bunch of unconventional soldiers being posted at Camp Ritchie. After all, these were authors, artists, actors, journalists, radio personalities, and virtuosos of various blends, all of whom spoke 2 or more languages. Not your typical soldiers drafted off the farm. And security might have played a role, as the PSYOPs mission was secret. Bottom line here, if Camp Ritchie had accommodated the soldiers of the additional 4 MRBs, we would never be discussing Camp Sharp. So a search for another location began. Why choose NP2, the former CCC camp? First of all, it was relatively close to Ritchie, 20 miles away. The commander of the Military Intelligence Training Center, who still had command of the MRBs, could visit the location relatively easily if needed. and the communications training used Camp Ritchie as a test bed, sending signals and communications back and forth. NP2 was an already existing facility, and no new or very little construction would be required. Camp Sharp was scheduled to be used for only a few months until the Normandy invasion kicked off, so very little effort was put into making it permanent or improving it, much to the chagrin of the soldiers, who had very little good to say about the poor living conditions. And with all the activity taking place in the Catoctin Mountains, such as the Shangri-La Presidential Retreat and the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, appropriating many locations for its training facilities, there may have been little or no opportunity to move close by. And that could have been intentional, what with the OSS having its own propaganda branch. Given all we have discussed, there may have been an additional factor and event that narrowed the search down to NP2, and that was personality-driven. By this man, Hans Habe was a Hungarian Jew with a fascinating resume. He joined the French Foreign Legion to fight the Nazis, was captured and imprisoned in France, then escaped and made it to Austria, where he worked as a writer for a newspaper and also authored several books, one of which was made into a movie. He eventually immigrated to America, married an heiress to the Post Cereal Company, his third wife, and where he was drafted into the Army in 1942. He was trained in PSYOPs at Camp Ritchie and served with the 1st MRB in North Africa. After the North Africa campaign, he returned to Camp Ritchie as a lieutenant in 1943 and was chosen as the point man for finding a new site. In November 1943, Habe was sent to Army headquarters in Washington and had a meeting with what we believe to be the G2, or intelligence section of the Army staff. In that meeting, it is believed that NP2 was selected as the new training area for PSYOPs and the location for training the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th mobile radio broadcasting companies prior to deployment to Europe. It can be assumed that Habe was motivated to identify NP2 as the new location, perhaps for security reasons, perhaps because of its availability, but also he knew that he would be the principal trainer and therefore a big man on campus as a lieutenant, even though the camp commander was to be a major. He was a born ham and loved to be the center of attention. He even dressed the part with various modifications and self-described improvements to his uniform to separate himself from the ordinary soldier. Reports are that he was an excellent instructor and passed on his extensive experience gained in North Africa to the new recruits specially chosen for this mission. And he chose them personally himself with access to personnel files in Washington. We can't be sure who decided to name the camp for one of the Civil War's most unconventional heroes, George Sharp, but it was very appropriate that the Army did so. A couple of the MRB soldiers had relatives who fought in the Civil War and might have found the name fitting. A successful lawyer from New York, Sharp had traveled and studied in Europe and also served in diplomatic posts in Rome and Vienna. Then when the Civil War broke out, Sharp enlisted and also raised 900 men to form the 120th New York. Later he was called to set up a new organization to gather information for the Army of the Potomac. It became known as the Bureau of Military Information. Sharp went way beyond the usual system of using spies for information, and he brought together such diverse sources as observation balloons, signal stations, southern newspapers, and scouts, what we would today term multidisciplinary intelligence collection. He had so much information that his aide, John Babcock, could draw up the order of battle for any opposing armies and estimate their strength accurately. Here you see a picture of Sharp on the left with his aide John Babcock at Gettysburg. You have already seen this photograph from Antigoni's briefing. This was CCC Camp NP2 in 1942 when it was closed. Just to orient you, the upper portion of the camp is relatively parallel with West Confederate Avenue. This is a sketch of the camp made by one of the artists assigned to the 3rd MRB in 1944. He later worked for Walt Disney. In this sketch, Confederate Avenue is parallel with the tree line on the bottom of the sketch. What you see here, starting from the left, is a rec hall, then an antenna tower, which was one of the only new items that were constructed in the camp. 4 of the 6 buildings in the middle are barracks for enlisted soldiers. The other 2 are the company headquarters and the battalion headquarters. The 2 buildings on the far right are a supply office and the officers' barracks. In the upper right are the motor pool, workshops, the dispatcher, and garages. The other 3 buildings in the upper center of the sketch are a mess hall, showers, and the latrine. The building in the middle closest to Confederate Avenue is the battalion commander's quarters. In this slide I have twisted the sketch so it is oriented in the same direction as the photograph on the previous slide. This enables you to see that the sketch and the photograph are virtually identical and confirms that no new or very little construction took place. This camp was ideal for rapid training and was not intended to be a long-term location for any military unit. Here I have placed the sketch and the photograph in the same general orientation. You can see that the sketch and the photograph match up almost perfectly, except for the circle area where the antenna tower was constructed. That antenna tower should have been left behind. When it came time for deployment overseas, the attempt to dismantle the tower for transport resulted in a bunch of twisted metal and a tower of Army CYA paperwork. A total of 4 companies were trained at Sharp. The 2nd and 3rd MRBs were considered trained by March 1944 and were deployed to Britain in April 1944 in time for Overlord. The 4th and 5th MRBs replaced them at Camp Sharp and began training in the same missions: PSYOPs, intelligence collection, document translation, interpretation, and interrogation of POWs. It was difficult in those days to specify which company any one soldier was in, as soldiers moved back and forth within companies as the mission required. The complete story of the MRBs is told in this book, Camp Sharp Psycho Boys, From Gettysburg to Germany, by Dr. Beverly Eddy, a professor at Dickinson College. Great story that goes into depth on the MRB company's operations in Europe. I think you can buy a copy at the Battlefield Visitors Center or online at Amazon.com. This is a photograph of Dr. Eddy at the former location of Camp Sharp, holding a copy of the sketch mentioned previously. I would like to now play a short video clip for you that will give you some insight into the Psycho Boys. After the video, Antigoni will discuss the 3rd chapter of the legacy of McMillan Woods. This secret camp was the training area for mobile radio broadcasting companies, or MRBs, whose mission was to convince German soldiers to surrender. These MRB soldiers, who were bilingual and multilingual, many of whom were Jews who escaped Nazi Europe, used various techniques to help senior Allied leaders achieve victory in Europe. Here in McMillan Woods, the men trained for a variety of assignments. Some might be sent to film or photograph battle scenes to be used in PSYOPs. Some would broadcast both true and fictitious news in a variety of languages. Some would serve as translators or interpreters. Others would interrogate prisoners of war, collecting valuable intelligence for the Allies. Others would appeal to German soldiers to surrender by broadcasting appeals right at the front lines or by shooting how to surrender pamphlets into German lines. They were also the on-scene liberators of some of the Nazi concentration camps and documented those atrocities in film and photographs at the direction of General Eisenhower. The war for these soldiers would take them from the D-Day landings in France through the end of the war in Europe and into the American occupation of Germany. But their journey began here in Gettysburg at Camp Sharp.
Now let's look at what happened to Camp Sharp after the mobile radio broadcast units moved to Europe following the D-Day invasion. This map shows the location of 600 prisoner of war camps throughout the country in World War II. If you think the map resembles the earlier one I showed you of the CCC camps, you would be right. Where else would the government find so many physical facilities that included housing, kitchens and mess halls, officers' quarters, and room for several hundred people at one time? Most of the POW camps were work camps. Because under the 1929 Geneva Prisoner of War Convention, it was permissible for detaining nations to benefit from the production labor of prisoners. So here lay an answer to the overwhelming need for farm workers throughout the country. Here in Gettysburg, Several different sites on the battlefield were used for German prisoners. In June 1944, the first camp was built along the west side of Emmitsburg Road, just south of Long Lane and near the line of Pickett's Charge. This was basically a tent camp built by 50 prisoners from Camp Meade in Maryland. Until they could finish the construction, they were housed at the National Guard Armory on West Confederate Avenue. When their construction was finished, the tent camp had barbed wire and guard towers in this location, which could house 400 to 500 prisoners and 90 guards. Most of the men brought here were young, and they had fought for Rommel in North Africa. So what was the reason for a work camp in Gettysburg? The prisoners were brought here to work in the orchards, in the canning factories, and on farms, since most of the local labor force had been drafted into the military. It was interesting to learn that the POWs were paid hourly wages, though I did learn that most of it was taken by the U.S. government to cover their living expenses. After the 1944 apple harvest, most of the prisoners were moved to other camps, leaving only 200 men here in Gettysburg. With the coming of winter in 1944, the POWs were moved over to Camp Sharp, where they could live in heated cabins. During the winter months, they were put to work cutting wood. Then in spring 1945, 350 more prisoners arrived in Gettysburg, and they were put to work in the canning factories. I'd like to inject a personal note here from my own family's World War II history. My parents lived in nearby Westminster, Maryland, and my mother wrote daily to all the men in the family who served in the military. That would be my father, his older brother, and my mother's 2 brothers. They were spread all over the world, from New Guinea to India to France and England. Here is a story from one of my mother's letters. She wrote, quote, "Here at 2 canning factories in Westminster, they just brought 300 German prisoners to work during the busy rush green pea season. And they say that they are just crazy about it over here. They're even willing to work without pay. They get 80 cents a day, plus their meals and board. But the men were amazed when they entered this country to find that New York wasn't bombed as they had been told. And they were so happy, some of them cried, to think they had been tricked, and to find things so nice here. Can you imagine that?" This letter is dated July 14th, 1944. So here's a close-up of some of the prisoners with the camp doctor, a remarkable man named Dr. Chester Christ. He often took his young grandson Tom with him to visit the prisoners. And Tom has shared this photo with me, along with stories of how well he was treated as a young boy by the prisoners. Look at them, and you can only surmise that some of them probably had little children at home, whom they sorely missed. And they probably had not seen any children for a long time. Dr. Christ himself was the Adams County coroner for 44 years, served as president of the Annie Warner Hospital. He was chief of the state tuberculosis clinic. He was medical director for Gettysburg College and the seminary, physician for the county jail and the almshouse, and somehow he found time to run a private practice. Dr. Christ developed a good relationship with the prisoners of war, and after they returned home, many of them wrote him letters sharing their appreciation for his care. By April 1946, the last prisoners left Gettysburg. With the end of the war, all the POWs were required to leave, and they had to return to Germany, even those who wanted to stay in the U.S. Now, a quick word about another nearby POW camp, this one on South Mountain near Pine Grove Furnace State Park. This POW camp was, like Camp Sharp, located in a former CCC camp, but it served a totally different function. This was an interrogation camp, not a work camp. This is where prisoners came first before being sent out to work camps, like the one in Gettysburg. The remains of this camp are more visible than in Gettysburg. They include the foundations of the buildings, walking trails, and rocks where the prisoners carved their names. While the buildings are no longer there, we do have this wonderful view of the camp, painted by a prisoner named Harry Backhouse. This painting lives today at the Adams County Historical Society, donated by the daughters of the camp commandant, Captain Lawrence Thomas. Captain Thomas, who was a World War I veteran, could speak and understand German. He also served as commander of the Gettysburg POW camp. Both of these camps were opened in June 1944 and operated until the war ended and closed in 1946. The stories of this camp are every bit as fascinating as the ones about Camp Sharp, but we'll have to save them for another program.
Let's take a look at Camp Sharp and McMillan Woods today. This slide is an overlay of the 1944 sketch and the McMillan Woods campground as seen today. The most interesting item I noticed was that the entrance road as it exists today had two of the buildings to the right of it as it passed back to what is now the horse trailer parking lot. Those buildings were the supply office and the officers' barracks. This is an aerial view of McMillan Woods with some of the Camp Sharp buildings outlined in red. This view is looking east towards Confederate Avenue. You can see the past locations of the barracks, the motor pool, the rec hall, the showers, and the latrine. Incidentally, the latrine location in the lower right is now the location of porta potties. I'm sure that's only a coincidence. A couple of pictures from today. The one on the left is the parade ground with the flagpole still intact. The one on the right is trees believed to be planted in the locations where the barracks once stood. This location is now used as a campground for scouts and other youth groups. It's unfortunate that these young Americans are visiting this spot without any idea about its role in United States history. What can you say about Camp Sharp, except that it is largely unknown and almost totally ignored, except by the veterans who were trained there, some of whom are still living? It is our sincere belief that the World War II generation was America's greatest generation. Their sacrifice is almost unmatched in American history. These heroes deserve any recognition we can give them, and the Black CCC camp deserves similar recognition. Visit the site and recall the maps we have displayed here. Take a few moments and reflect on the fact that the Gettysburg battlefield is not just a place where the Civil War soldiers gave, in Lincoln's words, the last full measure of devotion to save the Union. The battlefield also served as a training ground for the World War II generation, which saved the world from tyranny. So heed Lincoln's words. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Don't let us forget Camp Sharp. In an attempt to not forget Camp Sharp, we have organized a group of citizens working independently of any organization to try and honor this special place with some kind of marker. This slide shows you the remembrance items we would like to see on the battlefield. We would like to place a small sign under the McMillan Woods Youth Campground sign with the words Camp Sharp underneath. And we would like to place a privately funded plaque on the parade ground in front of the flagpole. The plaque would look similar to the mock-up in the next slide. I won't read the words on the left because they will probably change if we get approval to place the plaque in this location. Suffice it to say that the plaque gives a summary of the historical nature of this location. The photographs are MRB soldiers in action. This concludes our presentation on Camp Sharp. Obviously, we find this a very special spot on the battlefield, and we are so glad that the Historical Society allowed us to share our passion on the subject.